Hello everyone, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, inequality. It was the financial crisis which opened up fissures in Western society. Nowadays, though, corporate profits and stock markets are soaring. We look at how the rich get richer while the middle class and the poor get deeper into debt. Also this week, fishing, or rather the commercial overfishing, which was the death knell for this part of Newfoundland. But a revival could be underway if culture, care and tourism can really sustain an economy. And disruptive technology, the things which most of us love but which negatively impact a few. We look at Uber, the $18 billion taxi app that caused cab drivers to disrupt traffic across Europe's capital cities. Hello everyone, we're going big picture on Counting the Cost this week, the type of stuff which questions the whole financial system around us. Because as you'll see on this program, the rich are still getting richer while the middle class and the poor struggle with the little they have. Do you remember the Occupy movement, the one that started in Wall Street, the protesters who railed against a system they believe empowered the very Wall Street which brought Western economies to their knees? Well, now big-name economists like Thomas Piketty are effectively doing it too, highlighting the flaws in Western capitalism that enrich the few at the expense of the many. I want you to have a look at these charts because they tell the story. They do focus on the United States, but really this is common across other Western nations. It's 100 years worth of data on that bottom axis, and it shows that the top 0.1% claim 9% of the nation's income, and the same 0.1% on this chart sharing almost 22% of the wealth. That's 0.1%, but you've got the bottom 90% as well of Americans who, as you see from this graph, on the bottom line are falling deeper and deeper into debt. In fact, since the recession began in 2007, average household income has fallen 7%. That's the grey line there, whilst the stock market has doubled in value with the black line. You've got wages, simple story here with the black line. They have slipped to an all-time low. Corporate profits on the grey line, up to an all-time high, of course. And then this from the trade union AFL-CIO. All these symbols here represent 331 workers who collectively earn as much as one average CEO. Back in the 1990s, that ratio was 24-1. All those figures show that the cold, hard economics are acknowledging the inequality, that hollowing out the middle class and pushing down wages is detrimental to any economy. We're starting this week with a case study from London. Lawrence Lee has this in-depth report for Counting the Cost on the zero-hour contracts, where you have a job, but only just.
Tilbury Dockyard on the edge of London, yet another flashpoint in the conflict between employers and workers over 0 hours contracts. The dock owners want to put more staff onto 0 hours, taking away guaranteed work and benefits like paid leave. The union says it's an outrage.
Our members here find it a threat to their livelihood. It's cheaper for the employer, there's no stability for the employer, and it's very difficult to live on. And most of the members that we speak to that are on 0 hour contracts would very much like a permanent contract that they can plan their life and their finances around.
These workers aren't alone. All over this country, high street chains now offer work to people without any guarantee of how many hours a week they can work, if at all. This man agreed to speak in the dark for fear that he could lose what little he has if he was identified. He says he's seen the evidence of 0 hours contracts, creating nothing but uncertainty and fear.
I've seen amongst colleagues real hardships, yeah. I've witnessed hardships where there are times when they haven't got any money. They haven't got any money. And all that goes with that. And of course what you do is you help each other.
What, so you give some of the money sometimes?
You do notice that people don't eat as well at the end of the month.
What sort of thing?
I've seen people just bring in bread.
Slices of bread for lunch?
Slices of bread, yeah. But obviously we help each other out. So, I mean, you know, it's tough.
But these are people working in London. It's supposed to be one of the richest cities in the world.
Yeah.
It's even been reported that Buckingham Palace, home of the Queen, is putting staff on 0 hours. The palace would by no means be alone. It's not that 0 hours contracts are new, it's just that almost nobody ever used them, yet the financial crisis here and the years that followed appear to have given employers both great and small the opportunity completely to rewrite traditional concepts of employment law. And most strikingly, it's not even clear exactly how many British workers are on a 0 hours contracts. Some estimates are it could be as many as 5 million. The government has said it will penalise companies which are particularly mean to 0 hours workers, but they're more interested in ensuring that everybody pays into a pension scheme for their old age. But how to do that when you're on 0 hours? This man's paperwork suggests his pension, if he's lucky, will provide around $100 a year.
It's a piece of paper with work pension on. And it did make me laugh because, of course, it was just like all those lovely pension brochures that you get from any pension house, and you think, well, actually, they spent quite a lot of money on this, sending me this nice glossy magazine, but effectively it's worthless.
And pensions aren't the only problem being stored up by all this. How can an economy which is trying to get people to spend more and reduce debt levels expect that to happen when 0 hours contracts lead to the very opposite?
The people that argue for 0 hour contracts are the people that do want people to buy their goods. So you can't have a situation where Sports Direct, for instance, is paying most of its employees on 0 hour contracts, and then they can't afford to buy the trainers in the shop. It doesn't add up. So either we're going to get rising levels of debt, which we do have right now, or once that comes to an end, we'll just get falling consumption.
The government has said it won't ban 0 hours contracts. Indeed, ministers insist they helped get UK businesses through the financial crisis.
A number of employers say that actually the flexibility that the British job market offers them has actually enabled them to keep operating during the recession and to keep people in work by having that flexibility. That has meant that rather than companies going bust and people being unemployed, they were able to have that flexibility to see them through the tough times and then to come out the other side.
The government continues to insist that 0 hours work suits some people, but very many say they're being reduced to hardship while profits for big employers are boosted. This unravelling of traditional working arrangements in the UK is in many ways historic, and it helps answer a fundamental question that the UK's economic figures can look good on paper while so many complain about getting poorer. Lawrence Lee for Counting the Cost in London.
So let's build on what Lawrence outlined in his report there with Duncan Exley. He's the Executive Director of the Equality Trust in London. And, you know, Duncan, there are any number of statistics I could throw at you here when it comes to inequality, but I'm going to choose just one of them here. In the United States, the average CEO is paid 200 times more than his or her average employee. That is not right. It just doesn't sound right. When you put it into numbers like that, it doesn't make sense. And I wonder if it's just part of the problem, a few getting paid a lot.
Yes, I think that is a problem. If you look at the figures in the UK, they're not that far off. It's about 150 times more than the average person that a large company CEO will get paid. The average person thinks they should get paid about 6 times more. So this is far more than people think is proportionate to any extra work or talent they might have. And that is frankly damaging people's confidence in business and damaging society.
Look, I don't want to sound silly here, but why do they get paid so much? You know, it's like looking at footballers. You know, we've got the World Cup just starting now. People getting paid exorbitant amounts of money, and I wonder, can those amounts really be justified?
Well, I think that is part of the problem, that there is a culture of regarding people at the top as being pretty much superstars. If you read in the Financial Times, it will refer to them as talent. It will refer to their pay as reward. The pay of everyone else is referred to as labour costs. I think we have a big problem that pay for top people is set by other top people who regard that sort of thing as normal and really don't live in the same world as the rest of us and don't understand the same world as the rest of us.
And then we get to, broadly speaking, I guess, everyone else, where salaries have been cut and jobs have been exported, and we've done this report about the 0 hour contracts as well. Again, I'm trying to sort of place these things side by side here, where one small part is getting paid so much, and yet it's so much worse for everyone else here. Why, in your opinion, do corporations not address that level of inequality, or are they even doing something?
I think that corporations should address that level of inequality, and I think that what is happening is not in the interests of businesses. It is in the very narrow interest of a couple of people at the top of businesses who are really behaving in an anti-business way. They are pretty much a cuckoo in the nest of business. And there is a problem that no one else in business, the employees or the investors, is powerful enough to countermand that.
Yeah, but you know, to be fair, or maybe to play devil's advocate here, a company's job is to make profits. That's why it exists, isn't it? You know, especially if it has shareholders. It is there to make profits and maximize everything it can out of that company. That's why it's there.
Absolutely, and they should try to maximise profits, but by having very excessive pay gaps between the top and the rest, they're actually damaging their own profits, because companies where there is a big pay gap are companies where the motivation of the whole workforce tends to be lower. The productivity of the whole company tends to be lower. They are not maximising profits, they're just maximising the pay of the people at the top and damaging the team spirit of the business as a whole.
Okay, so let's discuss ways to change all of this then. There have been movements. We had the Occupy movement, which really started with a hiss and a roar, of course, but then started to peter out, it has to be said. And there have been, and there will be, more movements like this and slogans like the 1% and the 99%, which will stick, but they don't seem to make a difference at the end of the day. They raise awareness, you have to say that, but as far as making a difference goes.
Yes, well, I think this is something that has to come down to government action. The problem is such that it damages the entire economy. We are getting economies, and the US is one of them, the UK is another one, that are being damaged by the fact that most of the people haven't got very much money and they can't participate in the economy. A few people have got so much money that they're seeking to speculate in things like housing, which is driving up costs for the rest of us. It's an economic problem. The government must adopt a goal to reduce the gap between the richest and the rest if it doesn't want the economy and society to become very difficult to govern.
Yeah, but once you get the government too involved in what the private sector's doing, doesn't that create its own set of problems there?
It doesn't really cause that much problems. We already have a big problem in the UK and in the US economies. It is ruining the economies already. This is about rebalancing the economy.
It's Duncan Exley from the Equality Trust. Thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it. And still ahead on Counting the Cost, they're in a jam over Uber, the taxi app, which has got the old guard not too happy. More on that a little later on. Right now, though, we're headed to the northeast coast of Canada, an island called Newfoundland, where commercial fishing once supported hundreds of remote communities. But fishing turned to overfishing, and now these little outposts are in decline. The government's even paid for people to move out. But those who've stayed, well, they're finding new ways to live and work. With another special report for Counting the Cost, here's Daniel Lack.
At the edge of Canada, where the icy Atlantic Ocean washes a bleak shore, the fishing communities of Newfoundland nestle among the rocks. Many now abandoned or dying after the collapse of the cod fishery in the 1990s. This was one of them, Little Bay Island, 75 years ago when the fish were plentiful. Here it is today, just 52 people left. The man leading the push for government-funded resettlement says there's no going back to an illustrious past.
Fish plants going full tilt, stores, 5 or 6 stores there. Lots of people, 150 people, kids in school. But now you got 2 people in school, and that's it. And you never see no one there because everybody's that age. Nobody goes out there in the nighttime walking around. There's nowhere to go.
People tell me, well, you're nuts. I don't feel that way, but everybody's entitled to their opinion, I guess.
Last year, nearly 90% of residents voted to resettle, but not Perry Locke. He and his wife have 2 of the few full-time jobs. Their son thrives as one of the only students in school. Locke wants to stay, but awaiting a government decision he dreads, he sees little cause for hope.
It's almost like the mentality is there to just let everything go, till it just, everything collapses. I think that's where everybody's just figuring just leave it alone and let everything collapse and lock it up and leave.
In Newfoundland, they call villages like this an outport, remote yet close-knit, and once upon a time, vibrant and viable places to raise a family. Since the 1950s, nearly 30,000 people have been paid by the government to leave the coast, one of the biggest internal migrations in Canada. Officials say it's cheaper, more efficient to fund resettlement now than to keep delivering services to a dying community. Not everyone agrees.
There are things that we can do, I'm sure of it. I think most people would feel like me. It's just terrible to contemplate a Newfoundland with outports continuing to shut down.
On Fogo Island, a few hundred kilometers to the east, they're doing things differently, harnessing the arts, high-end tourism, and local craftspeople to rebuild and revitalize.
I think I grew out of these rocks, and there's nothing that I know that I didn't learn from these rocks somehow.
Zita Cobb was born here 55 years ago. She left in her teens and became one of the country's top businesswomen. While she was away, fishing collapsed. Now she invests her wealth to revive her home, attract tourists, and create jobs.
The only way to cure the plague of unemployment is to build economies that are based on culture, care, and craft. And that's what we've tried to do here.
Culture and craft shape Cobb's Fogo Island Inn, a stunning mix of contemporary design and local touches. The sea looms through every window. Motifs drawn from the self-reliance of island life are a constant backdrop. The island is known for its quilts, blankets sewn from leftover fabric. Using microloans modeled on Bangladesh's Grameen Bank, Cobb's charitable trust helps local quilt makers transform their craft into full-time jobs. International artists are part of the mix too, drawn by the setting, the unique culture, and by fully paid-for residencies. They work in modern studios, starkly positioned in remote bits of shore, taking full advantage of land and sea. Rural communities, Cobb believes, have cultural and human capital. You can't put that in a bank, but it has immense value. The challenge is to create jobs and businesses to support those assets, to get outsiders to come, appreciate, and invest in what's here.
I think about it as a quilt, you know, a patchwork quilt. Fogo Island is one little patch. Toronto is a much bigger patch. But neither one of those patches on their own can keep us warm on a cold winter's night. And I think what's really exciting is the ability we have to stitch together all the patches so you actually have a quilt, and therefore you have a country.
That communities exist at all in a harsh environment like this is a testament to human willpower and determination. Keeping them here, keeping them viable in a fast-changing world is going to take even more of that. For Counting the Cost, I'm Daniel Lack in Fogo Island, Newfoundland.
Finally, you might have seen the headlines about Uber this past week. There was Uber valued at $18 billion, but there was also protests against Uber blocking roads across Europe. If you're not up with Uber, then allow me to explain. It's basically a mobile app you use to hail a cab. You sign up with a credit card, and when you need a ride, you just use the app to find the closest available driver. You request them, they come and find you. Hey presto, you're on your way. In fact, a friend of mine in San Francisco who introduced me to Uber last year said the longest she's ever waited for an Uber car is 4 minutes. But such technology is shaking up the way business is currently done. Uber and its brethren are a real threat to traditional taxis. For example, the black cab drivers in London who say only they are allowed, under law, to have meters in their cars. So they protested in their numbers in many cities across Europe, making it tough for people to get around. Kind of backfired, though, when it was revealed that Uber had an 850% rise in people downloading its app during that time. So let's talk more about these so-called disruptive technologies with Ben Holmes. He's a partner at Index Ventures in London that has floated or sold 7 tech startups, each worth $1 billion or more this year alone. So Ben knows what he's talking about. I would like to start with Uber first of all. What did you think, first of all, of the numbers? A valuation of $18 billion after its latest round of fundraising. In PR terms, I reckon it's worth its value at the moment. I mean, that huge rise in the number of people using the app, the sort of taxi stunt, if you like, backfiring in that sense.
Well, it is very interesting. You actually saw a sort of technological disruption lead into a very physical disruption in London. I actually have an awful lot of sympathy for the black cabbies. It's a treat, a privilege and a pleasure to travel in a black cab in London, and I very much hope we can continue to do that for the next 20, 50, 100 years. I think what you're seeing is every single technological disruption, whether it's the music industry being disrupted by streaming technology, whether it's the offline retail industry being disrupted by online retailers, there's always a big agitation by the incumbents about what it's going to mean for their jobs and their livelihoods. And there's always regulators grappling to understand how should they categorize and how should they regulate this new industry. And the Uber story this week is a classic example of that, of an old industry that's being disrupted by technology. And I think what tends to happen is if you have a technological advance which benefits the consumer, as I think Uber clearly does, then it's very, very hard to stop that. And I think Boris Johnson said we can't disinvent technology, and that's definitely the case. I think the consumers will benefit long term, and I actually think for the cabbies who absorb what's happening and find a way to work with Uber and with other intermediaries like that, I think they can also benefit long term. But there will clearly be winners and losers.
You said it's a classic example here. Can you give me some more classic examples, interesting things which you've perhaps financed or you've been a part of, and which are, again, disrupting things and shaking up the way that we do business?
Yes, absolutely. So we were lucky enough to be investors in a company called Just Eat a few years ago, and Just Eat is essentially doing a similar thing to Uber, but in the takeaway food industry. Okay. So takeaway food in the UK is typically, it's a very small, characterized by many very small companies who would not have the wherewithal to get their products and services in front of consumers online, or let alone on mobile devices.
But see, Ben, I'm thinking about your average street food guy, you know, who's out there in London or anywhere, who's selling food, who relies on foot traffic and all that. Does he fight this sort of thing, or does he actually try to join up to it and go with the times?
The companies that have moved earliest to sign up with these new technologies and have really professionalized their operations to make themselves incredibly slick at delivering against those internet orders, they've grown, and generally foot traffic has decreased a bit. So I think it's a classic case of companies who adapt to the changing technology, have benefited, and there are probably some food outlets that were relying purely on foot traffic, and they may be seeing the foot traffic decrease as people choose to order through their phones.
I tell you what I think is interesting, just as a final point, is that obviously you're in London and we're talking about stuff happening in the UK, but this is becoming a European-wide sort of thing. We're not so much focusing on quote-unquote Silicon Valley anymore, California. We've got a whole other realm to talk about.
Well, I think that's right. Silicon Valley is clearly, it is the epicenter of the global tech industry, and many of the names which people are most familiar with in the tech ecosystem, Google, Facebook, Apple, are resident on the west coast of the US primarily. I think what's been fantastic over the last year is we've seen some fantastic winners emerge in Europe, and I think you mentioned we'd been involved with some of those, but we were involved in Criteo, which was one of the innovators in interactive banner ads. That was a company that was started in France and is now has been globally successful with that ad format. We were investors in Just Eat, which we've mentioned, and we were investors in King behind Candy Crush, which has been a phenomenal global success. So I think it's very nice that finally, I think there are some European companies which are starting to create billion-dollar exits, and the result of those exits are that it does tend to stimulate the broader tech ecosystem as the employees who have been through that experience peel off and found other companies, and as many of the successful and successful founders in those business also ultimately may peel off and start to reinvest in the new wave of startups in Europe. So I think it's been an extremely positive 12 months for the European tech ecosystem.
Ben, great talking to you. Ben Holmes joining us to talk disruptive tech. Thank you. And that's our show for this week, but there's more for you online at aljazeera.com. You click through to the programs link there, you'll find the Counting the Cost page. It's got all our previous episodes, including this one, for you to catch up on. You can get in touch with us as well on Twitter. You can tweet me at KamalAJE or our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali. And don't forget to use the hashtag Counting the Cost when you do, or just email us. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is the address. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.